Hi, guys. In the never ending list of fantastic guests that come on the show, that I'm fortunate enough to convince to come on the show, today I've got Dr. Shadi Hamid. Hi, Shadi, how are you?
Hi, Get.
Uh,
Good to be with you.
Likewise, let me just tell you a bit about him. He's a senior fellow at the Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution, which is a very famous think tank. Author of two books back to back, very quickly. You were in a manic phase. Islamic Exceptionalism: How the Struggle Over Islam is Reshaping the World. That's your latest one. And I think a year or two ago, you had another book, Temptations of Power: Islamists and Illiberal Democracy in a New Middle East. We'll talk about both of those books. But before we do that, I know that often when I have guests who are of a Arabic speaking background, people love to hear us speak in Arabic. So just to cater to the viewers, how about we break out some Arabic? So كثير محمس انه انا وياك رح نحكي اليوم. شكرا انه قبلت انه تجي على الشو.
العفو، جد. أنا مبسوط أنا معك الآن هنكلم.
شكرا حبيبي تشرفنا. All right, I basically said I'm very, very excited. If you heard the word Hamas, it's not that I was referring to the group. Hamas means fervor. So I was very excited. I have a lot of fervor in speaking to Shadi, and he said some nice pleasantries. I'm also happy, and so on. So there you go. Learn Arabic. It's a very beautiful language. All right, so I thought we'd start with walk us through the narrative of both your books, because they are ultimately sort of part of a greater narrative. Why don't we start with that and then see where we go?
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks again, Get, for having me. And so I guess my new book is called Islamic Exceptionalism. And basically the main argument I make there, and I suppose it's a somewhat controversial argument, is that Islam is in fact exceptional. It's fundamentally different than other major religions, in particular how it relates to law, politics, and governance. So in other words, so one example is Islam has proven to be uniquely resistant to secularization, both in theory and practice. And I think if we sort of start from that premise, that means we have to be careful about a lot of this talk of, oh, Islam needs to go through a reformation, and to be careful about superimposing Western Christian concepts onto a completely different religion. Islam will not necessarily follow the same trajectory, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. So I also want to challenge readers' assumptions that all peoples, cultures, and societies sort of have to follow this linear trajectory: Reformation, Enlightenment, secularization, liberal democracy, the end of history. I mean, it's so built into the assumptions of our national discourse, the way we talk as Western small L liberals, that I think sometimes we really have to make the effort to take a step back and be comfortable with difference. And I feel like the subtext of so many of the conversations I get into, even with, very well-meaning progressive liberal types here in the U.S., the subtext is, hey, you Muslims kind of have to get your act together, and you'll get there. It'll take time. We Christians went through all that. We had all our wars and religious violence, whatever. So it'll take time, but eventually Muslims will end up where we ended up. And I think that kind of talk, however well-intentioned it is, it's patronizing. And I think it's also ahistorical. And I think we have to be careful about expectations. So if reformation is the goal and we're trying to push Muslims or fit them into this reformation box, if you will, I think that can be counterproductive because it doesn't engage with the Middle East as the Middle East actually is.
Now, all that you just said, I would support in the context of trying to impose that linear progression that you're talking about in Muslim majority countries. What you're basically saying is, look, there is a culture specificity to each context, and it might be difficult to impose, this reality onto another reality. However, when there is mass immigration of people from Islamic countries to the West, then I would expect, and I would think you would support the idea that if you're going to come here, well, then you better go along very quickly with the ideas of secularism. It's not, you come to my house for dinner, it is my prerogative to say, oh, it's really, I really care, Shadi, if you take off your shoes, or, I really don't care about this. And you, as a good guest, will either decide whether you want to abide to this or not. So, yes, I can't impose this linear idea that you're talking about in Islamic majority countries, but can't I say, if you want to come here, you better take up the ideas of secularism, otherwise we're going to have a clash?
So I'd actually disagree a little bit with that. So I think that, well, first of all, there are many non-Muslim Americans who are citizens, some of them I know, who are not secular. They might be Orthodox Jews. They might be Christian evangelicals. And even if we talk about Trump supporters are kind of ethno-nationalist, white nativists, at least some of them. And that's contrary to America's founding ideals from my perspective. So the question is, what if there's a Trump supporter in Poland who wants to immigrate to the U.S. after Trump hypothetically becomes president? According to what you just said, then we would have to prevent that person from entering because they didn't subscribe to at least what I consider to be our founding ideals. And this is where we can debate, what does it actually mean to be American, and what are those founding ideals? So I think that you can have a very conservative, intensely practicing Muslim from, say, Jordan or Tunisia or whatever, and they may actually believe that Islam has an important role to play in public life, certainly in their own home countries. My expectation, if they wanted to immigrate to the U.S., would be that whatever their views on Islamic law are in their ideal world, that they would have to subscribe to the law of the land. So if they want to become American and live in the U.S., they have to express their religious beliefs within the context of the American Constitution. They can't break the law, for example, and say, hey, my religion says that I have to have 3 wives, so I'm going to, not follow U.S. law on X, Y, and Z. So that's where I think I would agree with you, that there is this basic minimal conception of American law and the American Constitution that everyone has to follow, and we follow laws. That's what we all do.
Well, I certainly would agree with everything you said right there. Practice your religion in any way you want, as long as it doesn't infringe 1 nano inch on the rights of a third party. That's very simple to implement. So you want kosher food, then you get kosher food in your own home. You don't impose it on other children in the cafeteria. If you do, then you're violating what I just said.
But you could call on people. You could write an op-ed, let's say, saying that other people should be eating kosher food.
Fair enough. I'm with you.
So people can express illiberal beliefs and illiberal opinions as long as they're doing so within a legal democratic process.
Fair enough.
Each country, so France has a different line of where that would be than we do, but yeah, so it differs from country to country.
Got you. Now, you use the term Islamic exceptionalism, and when I first saw the title, it reminded me of another term that has exceptionalism in it, and that's American exceptionalism. Now, typically, Americans view this as that, there's something unique about the experiment known as America that makes it exceptional in the positive sense of the term. And then, of course, famously, Barack Obama sort of didn't like that idea because he said, well, there's Greek exceptionalism and there's British exceptionalism, right? So how do we compare that instantiation of the term American exceptionalism to the way you're using that term in Islamic exceptionalism?
Well, I guess so. We were actually debating about which title to use. We had 2 kind of finalists, and I had some reservations about Islamic exceptionalism, but ultimately at the end, I felt this was the right way to go. I wanted the argument to be right there in the title. I wanted people to be clear about at least that basic thrust of the argument. But for me, exceptionalism can either be good or bad. So I realize that in the U.S. context, most people who use American exceptionalism are using it positively. Of course, there are some, let's say on the far left, who see American exceptionalism as maybe problematic. So I think it can go both ways. But in this case, except we have to look at how this exceptionalism manifests itself in different contexts or countries or situations. Sometimes it can be good, sometimes it can be bad. So I felt that it was a value neutral term in a way. And then it's up to readers to kind of come to their own conclusions.
And now walk us through your first book. What were some of the central premises in that book?
Oh, yeah, okay. So my first book was much more focused on Islamist movements and their evolution before and after the Arab Spring, with a focus on the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and Jordan, as well as in Nahda in Tunisia. And I was trying to understand how the temptations of power, and that's a title, affect some of these groups, because you see a remarkable reversal of fortune where in 2010 in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood is really in a difficult situation. It ends up with, after having like 80 plus seats in parliament, it ends up with 0, and the Mubarak regime is getting more repressive. And then you have the Arab Spring, and they're like, wow, we actually have an opening and we can try to pursue power. And I would argue that despite knowing better, they knew that it was dangerous, the temptations of power, but they succumbed to those temptations nonetheless. So I was trying to look at some of those tensions and to understand how Islamist groups were responding to the challenges of the Arab Spring. I also introduced in the second half of the book an idea which would become quite important to me, in the sense that I think it's colored not just the way that I look at the Middle East, but also political theory more generally, including in the US and Europe, which is this concept of illiberal democracy. And I think we as Americans, oftentimes, we use democracy as a shorthand for liberal democracy. But actually, these two concepts are at least sometimes in tension. So you can have more democracy, but less liberalism. So I wanted to, and the term was first popularized, of course, by Fareed Zakaria in his book, The Future of Freedom. And I think it's a concept that Americans have trouble relating to, because in our own history, these concepts tended to go hand in hand. But now, with the rise of Donald Trump, I think that we're seeing those tensions really sort of rising to the fore, that in my view, Donald Trump is a classic illiberal Democrat. So as far as we can tell, he'll respect the democratic process, although maybe some people would question even that. But he's someone who doesn't believe in small L liberalism in the sense of non-negotiable personal rights and freedoms, civil liberties, protection of minority rights, respecting the Constitution, including the Bill of Rights. The fact that he has an ambivalent relationship to some of those constitutionally protected liberties suggests that he's not totally on board with classical liberalism. So it kind of puts us as Americans in a bind when we look, let's say, at the Middle East and we say, okay, we're small L liberals, so we care about liberalism. We're small D Democrats because we care about democracy. What happens when those two come into conflict? And we're also seeing that now in Europe with the rise of the far right, the rise of Hindu far right nationalists in India, or even I think Israel's an interesting case where you see these tensions playing out. So that was an idea that I kind of introduced, that, okay, what if Islamists come to power through democratic elections, and they are, as far as we can tell, willing to respect the democratic process, but they use their position in power to promote what we as Americans would consider to be illiberal ideas, restricting personal rights and freedoms, at least to some degree. And again, we have to be mindful of context and nuance, and each Islamist movement is different. So in Nahda in Tunisia has a different approach than the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, even though they both are part of the overall, let's say, Brotherhood school of thought.
So you're basically saying, I mean, just so I could summarize everything that you just said, illiberal democracy is where you use the process of democracy to yield an outcome where the one who wins actually has an illiberal agenda. Would that be a fair, succinct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure,
Yeah.
sure.
Got you. Okay. Next, I thought we would talk about, and this I didn't read it from your book, but I'm suspecting that you probably cover it in your book. But I saw it in an interview you had done where you were talking about these different appellations, radical Islam,
Yeah.
whatever. And actually, I satirized this in some of my content on my social portals, where I basically keep adding qualifiers. So it's radical, zealot, militant, extremism, jihadi, blah blah blah, right?
Yeah.
Right, and I want to link this to something else you had said in one of your lectures at the Brookings Institution. You had talked about being able to put the word Islamic next to anything, right? Islamic finance, Islamic marketing, Islamic democracy. So then, taking these two thoughts together, why not just call the damn thing Islamic terror and stop, coming up with endless, infinite loops of new appellations to the term? I mean, that doesn't mean that every Muslim is a terrorist. It certainly means that most are not. We know this empirically, but it does mean that those who do it are doing it in the name of Islam by reading certain texts, by interpreting certain texts. It's not Vietnamese terrorism. It's not people who love Ford cars terrorism. It is Islamic terrorism. Would you support simple language as that, or that would not make you happy? Oh boy, that's a big sigh.
So to be honest, I'm not really invested in this whole debate about what to call things. I find it to be a little bit odd and sometimes a distraction. So, for example, after the Orlando shooting, Trump made this, in some ways, the number one issue in the national conversation, that we have to call it radical Islam or radical Islamic terrorism. I mean, the one term that I would not be comfortable with, it's my red line, if you will, is radical Islam. I'm not on board with that. It makes me uncomfortable. I think that it's become, so I might have been, maybe if you had talked to me 4 years ago, I wouldn't have cared that much. But I feel now that Donald Trump has appropriated radical Islam, it's almost become a stand-in for anti-Muslim bigotry. So I think that how we invest words with meaning matters. And if someone as prominent as Donald Trump appropriates a term, then we have to think twice about whether it's the best word to use, when I would argue there are more precise alternatives. So I don't have a problem with radical Islamism, radical jihadism, Islamic extremism, I'm fine with. The list goes on. Salafi jihadis. There's a lot of words that we can use depending on what specific phenomenon we want to highlight. And I think, just because, to err on the side of caution, that it's better to have more nuance than less. So, for example, one distinction that I'm careful about making in my own work is the distinction between mainstream Islamists and radical Islamists or extremist Islamists. So mainstream Islamists would be those that are willing to operate within the confines of the nation state. They participate in the parliamentary process. They're comfortable with electoral participation. So groups like the Muslim Brotherhood and Nahda in Tunisia, PJD in Morocco, so on and so forth. Where on the far right of the Islamist spectrum, we have groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, which are obviously quite a bit different in that they use violence and terror and don't believe in working within existing institutions or states. They don't believe in the democratic process because they believe that God is the sole lawgiver. So if you elect parliaments, that means you're investing people in parliaments with the ability to legislate, and they see that as an infringement on divine sovereignty. So I think those distinctions are important. So I'm not comfortable with the discourse of Islamism is the problem, or all Islamists are bad or the problem. We don't have to like Islamists as Americans and as small L liberals, and in some ways we shouldn't like what they stand for, and we should disagree with them on any number of issues. But I think, as someone who studies this phenomenon, I think it's important to put my personal inclinations as an American liberal to the side And I feel like my job is to immerse myself in the world of political Islam and to try my best to understand how these people or parties see the world around them and to convey that to the American reader so they understand what's going on here. I think that's very important from a scholarly perspective.
Got you. Let me just push back a bit.
Yeah, sure.
Very, very politely and always with a smile on my face, so don't worry. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to get all the fantastic guests that I get if I were, engaging in bombastic stuff. But anyways, so when you draw the distinction between, I'm not exactly sure what terms you use, radical Islamists versus, the gentle Islamists and versus the ISIS guys, the way I view it is that the ultimate goal is always the same, but the tools by which I go about achieving those goals are different. And so here it reminds me, I don't know if it was Gaddafi who had said this or some other gentleman, but who said that, look, we're going to conquer the West through the womb of our women, through hijrah, and by using your miserable system and freedoms against you. So in this third case, using your freedoms against you, right? So I could use democracy, I could use Western structures to fight for the ultimate objective, which is that Islam should, we could decide what that objective is. It could be that Islam should reign supreme. It could be, now, the ISIS guys are going about it in a very direct and rather bloody ways, whereas Tariq Ramadan is doing it with a beautiful French accent and a beautiful English accent and looks suave, and he could be the next James Bond guy. But ultimately, it's not as though they have differences in terms of what the ultimate game, the ultimate end of the game is. Is this a fair assessment, or am I getting something wrong?
So I think the end goals are actually quite a bit different.
Okay.
So I don't think it's a question of means versus ends, although that's important. But for example, Tariq Ramadan does not believe in slavery. Slavery is a big part of the kind of emerging ISIS theology. The hudud punishment, so cutting off the hands of thieves, stoning adulterers. As far as I know, if Tariq Ramadan was the head of a state, I don't think he would really be very interested in moving in that direction. And we know, so for example, the AK Party in Turkey, which comes originally from a sort of brotherhood-inspired approach, they don't talk about the hudud punishments. They don't talk about the strict implementation of Sharia law. Ennahda in Tunisia isn't interested in a very strict implementation of Islamic law. I can't imagine that Rashid al-Nushi, whatever his faults may be, would ever want to cut people's hands off. That's not how, and having spent time with him and having also read his earlier works before he was trying to impress the West as much, that wasn't part of his discourse even 20 years ago. So I think the end state, and Islamists don't agree about what the end Islamic state looks like, because a lot of them haven't actually been put in a position of power for long enough to experiment with it. So this is actually why a lot of Islamists disagree with each other, even within groups like the Egyptian Brotherhood or the Jordanian Brotherhood. You have defections, you have splits, you have very contentious disagreements because no one's actually done this before in the modern era. Like, we don't really know what this stuff would look like. So part of this is about letting the democratic process play out and hope that there are enough constitutional protections, that there is enough there that if Islamists would want to overreach, there would be limits to how far they could go. Of course, each society has to have a debate about where those limits are, right? And you can always make amendments to a constitution. Even here, we always talk about how non-negotiable our founding freedoms are and the Bill of Rights is and so on. But even here in the U.S., if you have 2/3 of both houses of Congress and 75% of the states, you can overturn freedoms that are enshrined in the Constitution. So there is no such thing as 100% non-negotiable rights. In most systems, there are ways to override constitutional protections if you have a large enough majority. So I think there's always going to be a question of where this balance is. But I do think, and I'll just say one more thing on this, is I think that it's not even just about Islamists. So there are even ostensibly secular parties in certain countries that want Islam to play a prominent role in public life. So, for example, in Malaysia and Indonesia, you have so-called secular ruling parties that use a lot of Islamist-style rhetoric. Even on the local level, they've actually presided over the implementation of Sharia ordinances in more conservative regions in both of those countries. Why? Because they have to meet the median voter halfway. If you're trying to win in a very conservative region,
You're thinking about like Aceh, right? Is it Aceh in Indonesia? That's more sort of ACEH.
yeah. They're the different regions.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what the status is in Aceh, but there are regions where there has been some experimentation because you have some degree of decentralization in Indonesia. So it's not just about Islamists. It's about there are a lot of ordinary Muslims, and this goes to actually one of the major arguments in the new book, Islamic Exceptionalism, is that we have to look back at the founding moment that Prophet Muhammad, so Jesus was a dissident against the reigning state. He didn't really talk much about governance and law because he was never in a position to govern a state. So naturally, the New Testament isn't really going to deal with these issues. But if you look at Prophet Muhammad, he was not just a cleric theologian or a prophet. He was also a politician, not just a politician. He was also a head of state. He was even a state builder. So naturally, the Quran has to have something to say about state building, right? It has to have something to say about law and governance. Otherwise, Muhammad wouldn't know what to do when he was governing in Medina, right? So I think that for any Muslim, they have to at least engage with that history. You can be a Muslim secularist and say that's no longer applicable. I think there's been some very interesting arguments from Muslim reformers. And I talk about Mahmoud Muhammad Taha in my book, a Sudanese religious thinker who's largely been forgotten, who is making very interesting creative arguments about how to reinterpret.
He was executed, correct?
He was in 85, I believe. Yeah. So I think that, but those people, they're going to have a harder time selling their argument of secularism because they have to argue basically against the prophetic model. So if Muslims are supposed to emulate the Prophet's example and the Prophet intertwine both religious and political functions, that I think predisposes Muslim majority societies to at least experiment with some role of Islam in public life.
All right, let me hit back at you with when you first said you disagreed that the end objectives of ISIS and many of the Islamists is the same. So let me sort of introduce some nuance there. It is absolutely true that in any text and in any objective, we can find people who otherwise are committed to the same grand goal to disagree on minutiae. And so we could talk about hudud and which parts we agree with and which parts should be allowed or not and so on. And that's absolutely true. Evolutionary science, I mean, there's no scientific theory that has more evidence in its favor than evolution. I mean, it is the absolute most accepted theory. I mean, it's as clear as gravity, right? And yet, evolutionary scientists debate on all sorts of issues within evolutionary theory, while not rejecting the idea that species evolve through evolution, right? And so so now when we talk about Islamists, there will never be a context where Islamists will agree that the leader of a state, let's call it like a caliphate, the leader of that would be a gay Jewish woman who wears a T-shirt with the cartoon of Muhammad on it. In other words, there are certain fundamental issues that most of us who are liberal and secular would find objectionable, and all those Islamists would agree on. So in a sense, yes, I completely concede the point that not all Islamists agree on whether the harsh punishments in Sharia should be implemented today or not. Fair enough. But do you know of any Islamist that says, bring on the gay Jew as the leader of the caliphate? I don't. Is there ever a context where we could reach it?
Right.
We won't. So
I think that I agree with you. so Islamists are not going to become liberals. So we also shouldn't deceive ourselves into thinking, oh, it's just a matter of time. They'll become more fluffy and gentle and all that. And that's also part of what I'm arguing against, that people, it's up to people to decide whether or not they want to be liberals. I mean, if they don't believe the things that we believe in, I mean, we might not like that, but ultimately that's a personal choice about what you think God is commanding you to do. Now, the interesting question in practice is, let's say there was a gay Jewish woman in a Muslim majority country. Obviously, a rather unlikely scenario, but if there was, it would be interesting. So I'd be curious what you think. I mean, what do you think? Let's say this gay Jewish woman announced her candidacy for president. I think that a lot of Islamists would just say, hey, we don't like her. They would attack her. They would say very bad things about her in the media, but they would assume that this person wouldn't get any votes. And they'd be like, okay, maybe that person will get 1 or 2% of the votes, so we don't have to worry about it that much. Hypothetically, if this person was very popular and actually had a chance of winning, then I think that would be an interesting test case.
Well, yeah. I mean, I guess you're right. Probably that they would be pragmatic in deciding how to handle her. Fair enough. But I mean, I think I did a SAAD truth clip recently where I looked at most of the countries that constitute the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and I picked ones that were, 99, 98, 97%, sometimes 100% Islamic. And I asked the question, gee, what happened to all the religious minorities in those countries? What happened to Jews in those countries? So it's not as though you need to be a sophisticated social scientist to understand the dynamics of what happens when the less tolerant versions of Sharia, etc., come into a place. That gay Jewish woman has, never mind, she has no chance of running in the elections. She better catch a next flight out of there very, very quickly, as we did in Lebanon. So again, I think the problem stemmed, I think one of the difficulties of this whole conversation is to always decouple individuals from ideologies. And it is so difficult to do when you're talking about an ideology that is rooted in religion, right? Because that's sort of one of the things that you don't do. You don't attack people's religions. But look, I and certainly you have known infinitely more nice Muslims than bad Muslims, right? And that's absolutely clear. I mean, that's an empirical fact. Yet, we can, with the exact same breath, say that Islam doctrines, or certainly many of the Islamic doctrines, when put properly to action, are deeply problematic. And I think that if we keep reminding people that making the second statement says nothing about the integrity and rights of Shadi Hamid, then I think we're on safe grounds. Do you agree with this?
So to play devil's advocate, sure. When you say that these things are deeply problematic, my follow-up question would be, according to who? They're deeply problematic to liberals. They're presumably not deeply problematic to Islamists, right?
Right.
So look, we all come at this from our starting assumptions, and I think oftentimes in the West we sort of assume that classical liberalism is neutral, but liberalism is only neutral to those who are already liberal. And I think that I think what makes liberalism so powerful is that it is ideological, but it's able to sort of play itself off as ideologically neutral. So I guess we can think something is deeply problematic and say that. And I think it also depends what exact outcomes you're talking about. So I think some interesting, question is, let's say an Islamist party comes to power and restricts alcohol consumption to some extent, or they met it in most of the country, but keep it legal in small parts of the country or whatever. That's an interesting case because, first of all, it's not a wild hypothetical. It's actually something that most Islamists ideally would want to do, and some have tried to impose some of these restrictions on alcohol consumption or production. But there is no constitutional protection for drinking. So So we might think it's deeply problematic because we think that anything that restricts freedom, autonomy, and personal choice is not good. But if that's expressed through the democratic process and a majority of, let's say, Jordanians agree, and they're calling on their elected representatives to see this bill through, it's deeply problematic, but it's also a manifestation of something positive, which is the give and take of democratic politics. So we also, I think, have to be able to say, even if we don't like the outcomes of democracy, as long as the process is legitimate and legal and respectful of having a debate before the legislation is passed, then the process can be good.
Okay, so let's suppose we go through a foolproof process and it clears all of whatever benchmarks you decide to impose on that process. And the vote, the referendum is, should gays have a right to exist or should they be thrown off buildings? What do we do then? 95% will say, yeah, let's do this. It was done through a very democratic process. Do we do it?
Well, first of all, I don't think that many Muslims anywhere in the world would support throwing gay people off roofs. But let's say
hypothetical. So
sure. So that would be a violation of any constitution that I'm aware of. So that would be a fundamental violation of the rights of citizens. I don't think there's any constitution where that would pass the muster of a constitutional court, because you can't kill citizens.
In the West, what if I'm under Sharia law?
Well, which constitution do you have in mind? Because so let's say in Tunisia, and Nahda, an Islamist party, was part of a constitution drafting process. And the constitution that's come out of it is, by at least Middle East standards, relatively liberal. You can't throw gay people off the roof according to the Tunisian constitution, the Indonesian constitution, Malaysian. I mean, you would have to change the constitution entirely to deprive entire groups of people of their rights. And I have trouble seeing how that would happen. First of all, you'd have international pressure. That would be outrageous from the standpoint of the international community. And if any Islamist party has come to power through democratic means, they don't want to become a pariah state. There's a limit to how far they're willing to go. And there is really no need. I mean, it's not as if there's a kind of a conservative taboo against public expressions of homosexuality from a cultural perspective in most Arab countries, let's say. So there wouldn't even be a sense that this would be something that would have to be addressed, because there's sort of a built-in conservative consensus. So there doesn't even have to be legislation like banning whatever it happens to be, because already most people are conservative, socially conservative on any number of these issues, whether it's alcohol consumption or gay marriage, gay rights, whatever it happens to be, right?
So in the case of, continuing with the process idea, in the case of when the Muslim Brotherhood came to power through a legitimate process in Egypt, and then of course they started doing some shady stuff that you and I would consider, as I guess instantiations of an illiberal democracy, then General El-Sisi comes along and says, okay, I'm not having any of this. Now, does the end justify the means, or how do you view this? So what would be your position on El-Sisi coming in and saying, look, these guys are going to take us down a dark road, and so even if I'm violating the process that you would want in place by, basically, getting rid of them, not through a democratic process, at least I am tilting us back to something a bit less illiberal. Would you support that, or would you be against that?
Oh, no, I wouldn't. So one of my non-negotiables is military coups against democratically elected governments. And so I was, so I remember the feeling I had on the day of the coup, July 3rd. And I remember this sick feeling, this sense of foreboding, because if those of us who have studied the history of military coups, we know empirically that military coups against democratically elected governments almost never produce positive outcomes. So I think it was fair to expect, hey, this isn't going to go so well. And I think we've seen the results of this process where the Sisi regime is actually more brutal and repressive than Mubarak. I would actually even argue there's a legitimate comparison to be made with the Nasser regime. And the Nasser regime was like pretty authoritarian. So we have more than 40,000 people arrested in prison. We have more than 2,500 killed. We have what Human Rights Watch calls the worst mass killing in modern Egyptian history. And that actually is, I discuss my experience leading up to the massacre in the book. And it's a very weird experience.
Sorry, before you go on,
yeah.
It's a massacre of political opponents, of Islamists. Just tell us a bit more details about what. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. So on August 14th, 2013, so about a month after the coup, which happened on July 3rd, 2013, Brotherhood members and supporters were gathering in two parts of Cairo, but the bigger sort of sit-in they had was in Rabaa. And so this is why it's often called the Rabaa massacre. And the military and security forces went in, and it was sort of like a kind of like tent city, people gathering for several weeks and so on. The military goes in, and about 1,000 people are killed in broad daylight in the matter of mere hours. So it unprecedented in modern Egyptian history. And it's actually hard to find such a high death toll for a day really anywhere else in the Middle East, at least in recent decades. So,
Syria.
It's interesting. There's actually been some debate about Assad generally has not gotten up to 1,000 in one day. Which is,
he needs to be more productive. He's not focusing.
Yes. I think that, so I was there until August 12th. So I left Egypt 2 days before the military went in. And it's an odd thing to wait for a massacre. So that actually has influenced me. It's sort of given me a darker view of human nature. Because so I'm born and raised in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania, but my family's Egyptian. And my relatives in Egypt, most of them are like hardcore Sisi enthusiasts. They hate the Brotherhood with a passion. They think that some of them actually, they're like, they have conspiracy theories. I don't know.
Don't tell me it's the Jews, man. Don't tell me it's the Jews.
No, they have conspiracy theories about me.
Okay, fine. Well, maybe they're saying that you're Jewish.
Oh, yeah. So it's sort of like, Shadi is part of like, U.S. government, Zionist, Qatari, everything put together, whatever it happens to be. So to see my own relatives openly cheering on mass killings of their fellow countrymen, that was sort of an interesting puzzle to me, is how do otherwise good people come to support terrible things? And these are people who are well educated, spend a lot of time in the West, speak fluent English, like everything we would think we would want or like. So how do we make sense of that? And you have millions of Egyptians who supported Sisi's coup, who would have said probably 2 years earlier, we support democracy, we're on board with the revolution. But they turned against democracy just a couple of years later. So, and I think so, this is where the question, you sort of touched on this earlier, about there was a fear that the Brotherhood would change the nature of the Egyptian state, that Egypt would never be the same. So I had really interesting conversations with my relatives where there was a kind of despondency. They felt that the Brotherhood would keep on winning elections and they would no longer recognize the country that they had spent most of their lives in. And that makes it so raw and existential. So they weren't willing to let the democratic process play out, but it's hard to have a reasoned conversation with them because it wasn't so much about what the Brotherhood had done during their 1 year in power. There's not a lot you can do in a year, even if you really wanted to, in Egypt. But it was more to fear of what the Brotherhood might do at some later unspecified point in the future. So essentially, people were arguing about things that hadn't happened yet. That's a tough one, right?
So they're following George Bush's preemptive strike.
Preemptive coup. That's, I think, how many Egyptians saw it.
Right. sorry, this is a bit of a personal question because I'm asking sort of your opinion to this.
Yep.
Since we're on Egypt, so
Yep.
there are these famous images where you juxtapose, and this is not just in Egypt. You could do it for Iran, you could do it for Afghanistan, where you superimpose photos of women from 1950s, 1960s, how they're dressed, how they look, and then you see it now. And you could do it in different ways. You could do it, oh, here's the faculty in Cairo of medicine, and here's how they looked when they graduated in 1952. Here's how they look with, right?
Yep.
And of course, you see massive infusion of Islamic garb. Is this something that you, on a personal level, bothers you when you see this particular change? In other words, when you see women from the Middle East. Now, clearly, it can't be that magically, millions of women have decided to have a new sartorial choice. They've decided that they want to wear it, right? So there has to be something in the air that compels most to force most to adhere to this new attire standard. Is this something that bothers you, or is it part of hey, it's part of freedom, who are we to judge?
So it's interesting because my parents have told me telling me stories about growing up in Egypt in the 60s and 70s and how rare it was to be at university and to see a woman covering her hair.
Let me interject. Sorry, before you go on. I grew up in Lebanon.
Yeah.
And you never saw anybody wearing. I mean, it was restricted to a very, very small class of people, typically not viewed very well, for you to be covered, even in the most minimalistic sort of Islamic garb. And then, of course, now it's changed. But anyways, go on.
Yeah, so it was rare just a few decades ago. There was what we might call an Islamic revival, which gained steam in the 70s and continued through the 80s and 90s. And so something did change in the broader culture. People wanted to become more religious. Now, we can debate why exactly that was, but there certainly was a previous period in the 50s and 60s, for example, the sort of heyday of secular nationalism or socialism in some countries. And Gamal Abdel Nasser, the Egyptian president, sort of captured this moment in Middle Eastern history. But in the broader sweep of history, though, I would see those few decades of secular nationalism as the exception, as the aberration. And that what we're seeing in recent years and decades is actually more of a return to the norm than divergence.
Have you seen the famous clip of Gamal Abdel Nasser speaking to the parliament where he's making fun of that attire?
Yeah. Yes.
Boy, he must be one racist, bigoted Islamophobe.
Right. Good point.
Yeah.
So, look, I think for me, my red line on this would be I don't think that people should be forced, obviously, to wear anything against their will. And I think all of us should be able to agree on that. But if someone is making a personal choice, and the vast majority of people who wear hijab or headscarf in a place like Egypt, and certainly here in the U.S., I mean, all the Muslims that I know throughout the U.S., it's actually more the case that if they decide to wear the hijab, they have friends or family that are against it and are like, wait, hold up there. And it becomes an issue in the family rather than the other way around. So as long as people are doing it out of personal choice and they're affirming their identity, however they want to view their own identity, more power to them. I mean, I'm very uncomfortable with the French approach to this, where you can't be a French Muslim citizen and enter certain state institutions with the headscarf. That's a choice about a piece of clothing. And the fact that the French government is essentially telling you that you have to choose between being French or observing what you consider to be your religious obligation, because the mainstream scholarly opinion, at least now, whether we like it or not, is that headscarf is fard or obligatory. So that's what a lot of Muslims think. So to tell them that either they're wrong or stupid or that they can't actually observe their own religion in the way they want to, that to me is a pretty serious infringement on religious freedom. Maybe that's my American background coming out. The French obviously view this quite differently.
But see, like, so let me add to what you just said.
Yeah.
I would agree with you in terms of from the freedom angle. But let's look at a pragmatic issue. I mean, I lived at one point in Montreal in an area that had a lot of Hasidic Jews who dress in a particular way, right? And certainly, let's look at the men who it's more conspicuous how they dress, how they wear their hair, and so on, right? By me making that choice, if I were a Hasidic Jewish guy, I am creating a delineation. I mean, I hate that term othering and all this stuff. I hate this kind of postmodern, right? But by me doing that, I am placing my religious identity so at the forefront of who I am that by definition, other people would have to be lobotomized not to use that very clear, conspicuous marker as the first thing that is associated with you, right? And then there are all sorts of downstream implications, some of which might be right, some of which might be wrong, about that would be implied by me wearing that. So by you wearing that, the hijab or the nikah, now, okay, of course, I know the other ones are a bit more serious because it removes your identity, but isn't it also the case, so when you're talking about the people in America, the American Muslims who are fighting against the women who choose to wear the hijab, what they're basically doing is saying, look, why don't you assimilate in a way that you could still retain your belief system, but it doesn't mark you as an other precisely by the fact that, right? I don't walk around with a 17-inch Star of David tattooed on my head to reaffirm the fact that I'm Jewish. It's a private thing. Maybe Shadi knows it, maybe he doesn't, but it's a small part of who I am.
But putting a Star of David on your head is not a religious obligation in Orthodox Judaism. I mean, again, this goes back to so the Muslim woman in America in question, she wouldn't be able to retain her religious beliefs if she had to take off her hijab, if she believes that it's religiously obligatory from the standpoint of God.
Right.
I mean, again, like that. We may disagree with that interpretation, but if that's what you believe, that's what you believe. If you think that you're going to be held to account in the day of judgment for not
by
wearing
your hairs, you will be hung in the eternal fires of hell. So
that's why this kind of desire to assimilate. I'm all fine with integration as long as people are able to retain their identity or heritage. So similar, but you make an interesting point that if an Orthodox Jew is dressing a certain way, that's the first thing you notice about that person. But I would say, why should that be a threat to us who are different? So that's I don't know. That would be different than what I'm used to.
Well, I want to invite him to a barbecue, and I know that I'd like to be friends with him, but I know that I now have to do also kosher stuff. I better make sure that the sausages that I have don't have any pork in it. There is a means by which I can use my brain to say that if this guy is dressed this way, there is a set of beliefs that come with him being dressed this way.
Yeah, sure.
Right? And so by the mere fact of doing something as innocuous as which type of clothes you wear, you are drawing a line between you and me. By definition, it has to be. I mean, that's why you actually do it, right? I mean, that's part of why Hasidic Jews do that, right?
Yeah, they want to be different.
Well, exactly. And so then you can't speak from both sides of your mouth. I don't mean you. I mean anybody who says that, right? By saying on the one hand, please don't other me, while I do every single action to other myself. So you have to decide. I mean, if you want to be fully integrated in every possible way, then maybe you should take a bit extra effort to not make choices that would cause people to naturally draw a line between them and you. Yes? No? What do you think?
Yeah, I think there's a tension there. You're definitely right. That's why, for example, and I was watching the Republican convention last night, and obviously the slogan was "Make America One Again." And I guess when I was thinking about that slogan a little bit more, I thought to myself, hey, I'm not sure if I want America to be one in the sense of people needing to be like everyone else or kind of promoting a kind of uniformity of behavior. I think what makes America great is that we we respect difference, but we also celebrate difference. So if I see a Hasidic Jew, I'm like, wow, that's pretty cool that he can be fully comfortable expressing his religious beliefs, and he also would self-define as American and be proud of it. That to me is what's different about America, that you can become American even if you have strong religious beliefs, Christian, evangelical, Orthodox Jew, practicing Muslim, whatever it happens to be. And that I think it's up to us or anyone else to be more open to that kind of religious practice. So yeah, my Hasidic Jewish friend, I can invite him to my barbecue. He then has a choice to come or not come, right? Maybe you wouldn't have to make everything kosher, but you would have vegetarian options, and that would also include people who are vegetarians, right? But no one's forcing you to change how you conduct your barbecue. Right. That's still your choice.
Fair enough. Since you mentioned the Republican convention yesterday, I thought we would end today's chat, and of course I could keep you here for another 5 hours, by reading you. So this is about immigration. I've done this on a few previous occasions. I even did a SAAD truth clip on this exact point. So please bear with me. I'd like to read you a long quote from a racist Nazi Islamophobe, and then you're going to tell me what you think of this horrible Islamophobe. So here we go.
I'm ready.
All right. The flow of immigration into Canada from around the world, and in particular the flow from Muslim countries, means a pouring in of numbers into a liberal society of people from cultures that at best are non-liberal. But we know through our studies and observation that the illiberal mix of cultures poses one of the greatest dilemmas and an unprecedented challenge to liberal societies such as ours, when there is no demand placed on immigrants any longer to assimilate into the founding liberal values of the country to which they have immigrated. Instead, a misguided and thoroughly wrong-headed policy of multiculturalism encourages the opposite. Please bear with me. There's a bit more.
Oh, yeah, I'm
okay. Okay. We should not allow bureaucratic inertia to determine not only the policy, but the existing level of immigrant numbers and source origin that Canada brings in annually. We have the precedent of how we selectively closed immigration from the Soviet bloc countries during the Cold War years, and we need to consider doing the same in terms of immigration from Muslim countries for a period of time, given how disruptive is the cultural baggage of illiberal values that is brought as a result. We are, in other words, stoking the fuel of much unrest in our country, as we have witnessed of late in Europe. One last paragraph. Lest any member wants to instruct me that my views are in any way politically incorrect. The Islamophobe is the Jewish Islamophobe is about to reveal himself. Or worse, I would like members to note that I come before you, as a practicing Muslim who knows out of experience from the inside how volatile, how disruptive, how violent, how misogynistic is the culture of Islam today and has been during my lifetime, and how it greatly threatens our liberal democracy that I cherish, since I know what is its opposite. Professor Salim Mansour, October 1st, 2012 speech before the Standing Committee on Citizenship and Immigration, House of Commons, Parliament of Canada. What do you think of this Nazi Islamophobe, Shadi?
So I wouldn't use the word Islamophobic to describe it. I think we have to be careful about, kind of painting everything we disagree with as Islamophobic, obviously. And sometimes there's maybe a little bit too much of that. I think that I wonder if Professor Mansour would be consistent. So if the real dividing line is illiberalism, then would there be an ideological test for Christian refugees or immigrants from Poland or France? And would there be a requirement for them to prove that they are small L liberals? If he is willing to apply that consistently across the board with all religions, that would be interesting to me. Myself, I'm uncomfortable with ideological tests, because then you're privileging which conception of classical liberalism, which philosophers are you going to prioritize or emphasize in your judgment of who's sufficiently liberal. it sets a dangerous precedent. Even the idea of an ideological test, it makes me jittery as an American. Ideological test. It should be, are you willing to be or become American and to follow the laws of the land? And then you find your own way. Great. I think Canada also has a similar ethos, right? Maybe France and Britain, there's a little bit of a difference there. So I guess, I mean, how do we feel about Christian evangelicals immigrating? And there are large and growing evangelical communities in Africa. How do we feel about their immigration? Because a lot of Christian evangelicals are not what we would consider to be small L liberal, at least on some social issues.
So can I interject?
Yeah.
So this kind of speaks to this idea of equivalences, right? So, for example, two people could be overweight, and we could label them as overweight. One is 200 pounds overweight. One is 20 pounds overweight. If we restrict the description to them both being overweight, then they're both overweight, and it ends there. But if we say that size matters, forgive the pun, then 200 pounds is more overweight than 20 pounds. So while, of course, nobody is contesting the fact that illiberal forces can arise from countless places, whether it be religious places, whether it be cultural places, there is no monopoly on illiberalism that comes only from Islam. I mean, only a fool would say something like this, right? But we also know that in the world that we live in today, not in a hypothetical world, in the world that we live in today, very few of us are staying up at night worrying about evangelical Polish people, right?
Speak for yourself.
Oh, you really? You're worried about the Poles? Okay, fine.
Okay.
So I think the idea is that, of course, I would be the first to concede that there is hatred, stupidity, illiberal ideas, totalitarian thoughts that come from a million sources. And anybody who thinks that it somehow is unique to Islam, I mean, is a fool. You just have to open a book and know that it's not true. But in the world that we live in today, it certainly has to be the case that most people with functioning brains are more worried about a wave of 1 million people coming from Afghanistan and Pakistan and Syria, who, while they might be lovely people, have been inculcated with profoundly conflicting values to the ones that they will see in France and Germany. We're not worried about Slovenians. We're not worried about the Vietnamese, for good reason. So am I wrong in thinking this?
Yeah, look, and I'd be the first one to say, I mean, I actually, I myself have been attacked from both left and right for different reasons. I don't really fit in the politically correct box myself because I'm arguing quite openly, it is the title of my book after all, that there is something different about Islam. So I'd be the first one to agree with you that Islam is more in tension with classical liberalism than Christianity is, or than Judaism is, or than Hinduism is. So I take that, and I think that we have to speak frankly and openly. Not all religions are exactly the same. That would make no sense, because then what would be the point of having different religions if they're all basically the same? Each religion has boundaries of belief. Each religion has creedal requirements, and they differ. So there is some more tension, and you're right. If 1 million Pakistani refugees came to the U.S., there would probably be issues regarding integration and multiculturalism and so on. But then again, I worry about these kinds of hypotheticals because no one's actually talking about, well, I suppose with the exception of Germany, is talking about having hundreds of thousands of Muslim refugees. But I do think we have to balance different priorities and goods. So we might say, hey, there's going to be an integration challenge here for some time. On the other hand, though, more than 400,000 Syrians have been killed in the Syrian civil war and because of Assad's brutality. So I think that our moral obligation as the international community, as Western humanitarians, that obligation takes precedence over any concern regarding the difficulties of integration. For me, that is an urgent demand. It's probably, perhaps in some ways, the most urgent demand of our time. from a humanitarian perspective. So we have to balance that, and people can disagree about what they hold more dear. And I think it's also, I think it takes two to tango. That obviously refugees who are going into Germany have to do as much as they can to integrate, but I think